Simone Avery stepped into the first-class cabin with the same quiet grace she wore in every room she entered, a silk scarf knotted loosely around her neck, and confidence stitched into the folds of her tailored charcoal gray pantsuit. She moved with the kind of composure that turned heads without trying to. The hush of the cabin softened further as she made her way to seat 3A, a window spot she had deliberately chosen for the solitude it offered. She nodded politely to the other passengers, even as a few pairs of eyes flickered her way, some curious, others dismissive, all colored by the same quiet question. Does she belong here? Simone had felt that question her entire life, not always in words, but in glances, hesitations, the subtle tightening of smiles that never quite reached the eyes. She had long since learned to meet that unspoken doubt with a steadiness so calm it felt like stone. She placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment and eased into the wide leather seat, exhaling a soft breath and letting her shoulders relax. This was meant to be a rare moment of rest, one she had earned through long nights, complicated negotiations, and the exhausting weight of being the only black woman in too many boardrooms. The cabin crew began their pre-flight service with polished precision. A smiling attendant offered drinks to the passengers across the aisle. Champagne flowed freely into slender flutes, accompanied by warm towels and practiced greetings. Simone waited, reading over the menu, her fingertips brushing the gold-embossed letters that promised artisan dishes and premium wines. When the flight attendant finally stopped at her row, the temperature shifted. The woman's name tag read Tina, and her professional smile dulled as she took in Simone's face. "Can I get you something to start with?" Tina asked, her tone clipped at the edges. "Yes, thank you. I'd love a glass of champagne," Simone answered, her voice warm but reserved. A flicker of something passed across Tina's expression. Disbelief? Dismissal? "Champagne is reserved for our first-class guests," she said, the false sweetness in her voice as thin as paper. "Are you sure you're seated correctly?" There it was, that familiar sting, sharper than a slap because it came dressed in civility. Simone felt her chest tighten, but her face remained unmoved. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. "I'm quite certain," she said calmly, reaching into the pocket of her coat and handing over her boarding pass with an elegance that bordered on defiance. Tina looked down at the ticket, her mouth pulling taut as she confirmed what she should have known the moment she saw Simone. She belonged. But instead of an apology, Tina merely handed it back and walked away without another word, without the champagne, and without an ounce of the kindness she'd shown the man in the next row. Simone sat back, her fingers curling subtly around the leather armrest. The humiliation simmered beneath her skin, not just from the insult itself, but from the knowing laughter that followed when Tina and another attendant exchanged whispers at the front of the cabin. A quiet snort, a sideways glance. The unmistakable punchline of her existence delivered again, as if she were a joke no one had the nerve to tell aloud. It wasn't just the drink, it was the assumption, the reduction, the erasure. But Simone didn't call out. She didn't raise her voice or demand attention. She let the moment hang in the air like smoke, thick and undeniable, while she retrieved her phone with smooth fingers and tapped a name buried in her contact list. Corporate Liaison, Sovereign Air. It wasn't a dramatic move. She didn't slam anything down. There was no gasp, no confrontation, just a gentle breath and a quiet conversation in a low, controlled tone that not a single person could hear, but everyone felt. And that's where her power lived, in stillness. Simone had learned long ago that calmness could be sharper than any shout, that silence could echo louder than outrage. As she placed the phone back on her tray table and folded her hands neatly in her lap, she became an immovable presence in that cabin. Not a woman begging to be seen, but one who knew she was being watched. And for the first time, it wasn't her skin color or her seat that commanded the gaze. It was the storm behind her silence. The champagne wasn't the point. It never had been. It was the principle, the deliberate denial, the casual cruelty dressed as procedure. Tina and her colleague didn't know yet what that moment would cost them, how far the ripples would spread from the stone they had tried to drop quietly into Simone's day. But the other passengers felt it, the shift, the realization, that maybe they had seen something ugly masked by smiles, that maybe they had looked away too many times before. The businessman across from Simone, who had smirked at her earlier, cleared his throat and sat up straighter, suddenly unsure of himself. A woman 2 rows back who had once looked through her now looked toward her. Simone's expression never changed. Her stillness was both shield and sword. She didn't need to raise her voice to make herself heard. She didn't need to fight to prove she belonged. Her very presence was the proof. And in that cabin, high above the clouds, her calm strength began to bend the atmosphere around her, subtle, steady, and unmistakably unstoppable. Janelle Brooks sat still, her body unmoving, yet every part of her was ablaze. Beneath the sleek navy blouse and tailored slacks, under the gold cuffs that framed her wrists with quiet elegance, her pulse thundered. She had just been humiliated, openly, intentionally, by someone who had looked her in the eyes and decided she didn't belong. She had asked for a glass of champagne, the same as any other first-class passenger. And the flight attendant, with a forced smile and eyes laced with disdain, had told her that's for first class only. As if she hadn't just placed her bag in the overhead bin above seat 1A. As if she hadn't worked 20 years to become the founder and CEO of one of the top consulting firms in the country. As if her mere presence, her dark skin and composed posture, couldn't possibly align with the luxury that had surrounded her. Janelle didn't move when the flight attendant strutted away without offering an apology, didn't flinch when a nearby passenger chuckled under his breath as if enjoying the show. She didn't breathe deep or blink away tears. There was no performance here, only precision, only fire wrapped in velvet. She had choices. She could raise her voice, could throw the kind of scene that would be entirely justified. No one would blame her. Not really. But Janelle knew what that would cost. She'd be labeled difficult, angry, a disruption. And her words, however true, would be drowned in the stereotype of the overreacting black woman. No, she wouldn't give them that script. She'd write her own, one they would never forget. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, pulling out her phone. There was no hesitation, no pause, just the swift, deliberate motion of a woman who had spent her entire life planning 3 steps ahead of every insult, every dismissal, every moment of polished cruelty served with a side of policy. Her thumb hovered over a single name in her contact list, Darren Miles, SVP, Global Aviation Group. Direct line. She tapped it once. The ring barely lasted half a beat before it was answered. Darren Miles speaking. The voice was brisk, clipped, the way only executives sounded in their most tightly managed moments. Darren, Janelle said, her voice low but laced with steel. This is Janelle Brooks. I'm on flight 482, first-class cabin. There's a matter requiring urgent attention. The shift in his voice was immediate. Ms. Brooks? What happened? She didn't raise her voice. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. She gave him the facts. Clean, clinical, cutting. The name of the flight attendant, the comment, the dismissive refusal, the laughter, the passive passengers, the second attendant who smirked and whispered. All of it. She spoke with the efficiency of someone used to solving billion-dollar problems before breakfast. But beneath every word, you could feel the weight of something ancient. Generations of women who had been denied, dismissed, disrespected, and told to stay quiet. She wasn't quiet, she was composed, and that composure was power. Understood, Darren said. And in his tone, there was something new, not just concern, but fear. I'm activating our operations team. You'll be addressed immediately. Please stay seated. She ended the call and placed the phone on her tray table with the same precision one might use to set a blade. From the outside, it looked like nothing had happened. But inside, the cabin had shifted. The tension was real now. The air heavier. Around her, eyes flicked in her direction. Some with curiosity, others with discomfort. The businessman across from her adjusted his cuffs awkwardly. The elderly couple 2 rows back had gone oddly still. No one spoke. No one laughed. They all felt it. A reckoning had begun, and it was coming fast. Within minutes, the murmurs of the cabin grew louder. Something was wrong. The plane wasn't taxiing for takeoff. Flight attendants clustered near the galley. You're whispering frantically. The same attendant who had mocked Janelle now paced in short, agitated steps, checking her tablet, then glancing toward the front of the cabin. When the intercom buzzed to life, the captain's voice sounded unnaturally stiff. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be experiencing a brief delay due to a coordination matter. Thank you for your patience. Janelle remained still, watching the unfolding panic without a flicker of emotion. This wasn't a tantrum, it was a strategy. And they were scrambling now because she had forced them into a spotlight they never expected. A few passengers cast nervous glances her way. Some avoided her eyes entirely, while others, those who had perhaps once scoffed or smirked, now sat in a silence that bordered on reverence. She didn't revel in it. She didn't smile. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about clarity. About showing people what it looked like when someone refused to let injustice stand, even in a space designed to insulate people from consequence. Then came the moment no one saw coming, the click of the cabin door unlocking mid-boarding. A man in a charcoal suit stepped in, flanked by an airline staffer and a uniformed security officer. The murmurs in the cabin died instantly. The man's eyes scanned the room and locked onto Janelle. He strode forward. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly. "I'm Alan Reed, Director of Flight Operations. May I have a word?" The lead attendant went pale. The second one backed into the galley. Janelle nodded once, slowly, then gestured to the aisle. "You may." And so the unraveling began. But this was just the middle of the story. You see, this isn't about champagne. It never was. This is about the audacity of someone believing they could strip a person of dignity with a single sentence, and the elegance with which that person chose not to scream, but to strategize, to call power without raising her voice, to press a button and with it shift the ground beneath those who thought they'd won. And now we ask you to stay with us, because what happens next doesn't just change a flight, it changes a company, a culture, a standard. And maybe, just maybe, it reminds every person watching that power doesn't always come loud and wild. Sometimes it's calm, it's deliberate. It's Janelle Brooks making one phone call and setting the sky on fire. Are you ready to see how that fire spreads? Stay tuned. By the time the senior operations manager stepped onto the aircraft, the cabin had already begun to hold its breath. Something about the way he moved, shoulders set, jaw tight, clipboard pressed firmly to his chest, made it clear this was no routine visit. His badge caught the light. Derek Shaw, Global Air Operations. He paused at the front of the first-class cabin, scanned the space, and walked directly to seat 1C. Imani Wells looked up from her tablet, her face unreadable but her spine perfectly straight, her fingers loosely intertwined on her lap. The eyes of every passenger followed Derek's path, but she didn't shrink under the attention. She met it with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through the last 90 minutes of casual cruelty dressed as policy. "Ms. Wells," Derek said, his voice low and firm, "I'm here on behalf of the airline to formally apologize and take immediate corrective action." Imani offered him a polite nod, but said nothing. Her silence was not empty, it was pointed. It asked, "And what took you so long?" Tina and Blake, the two flight attendants who had denied her champagne, questioned her seat, whispered behind her back, and laughed in her face, watched nervously from the galley. Their earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by rigid shoulders and shifting feet. They had assumed, like so many do, that she would take it, that she would absorb the insult, the dismissal, the insinuation that she didn't belong in first class. They had assumed that because Imani was calm, she was powerless. But what they didn't know, what they hadn't bothered to consider, was that Imani Wells wasn't just a frequent flyer. She was a civil rights attorney who had just won a major settlement for airline discrimination the previous month. And this time she hadn't even needed to raise her voice. Just a call, just a name, just a reminder that silence is not the absence of strength. But it wasn't just their words that had stung. What no one in that cabin knew yet was what had happened just before boarding. While waiting at the gate, Imani had stepped away to take a call from her niece, Kayla, who had recently lost her mother, Imani's sister, to a long battle with cancer. Kayla, just 17, had been trying to stay strong, but today she had broken down. The world had felt too heavy. She didn't want to go to school, didn't want to get out of bed. Imani had crouched behind a column near the gate, whispering words of reassurance, steadying her voice even as her own heart ached. "You're not alone, baby," she had told her. "You're strong, and I'm here every single day." When she hung up, her hands were still shaking. And not 10 minutes later, Tina had met her at the plane door with a raised brow and a fake smile that said everything about what she assumed. Not "Welcome aboard, Ms. Wells." Not even a simple "Good evening." Just a flat "This is first-class boarding," as if Amani had wandered in by mistake. As if her grief, her exhaustion, her elegance, her existence was somehow offensive. So when Derek Shaw turned away from her and walked directly to the galley, when he addressed Tina and Blake in full view of every passenger, Amani didn't need to say a word. The moment spoke for itself. "I've reviewed the passenger's ticket, I've reviewed the service footage, and I've spoken to executive relations. Effective immediately, you are being removed from service for misconduct and violation of company protocol," Derek said. His voice was measured but resolute. Tina gasped. Blake's face blanched. "This is a misunderstanding," Tina said, but even she didn't believe it. "It's not," Derek replied, "and we're not going to wait until landing. Please collect your things." The entire cabin was silent. One of the passengers, a man in a tailored blazer who had earlier chuckled when Tina made her snide remark about people not knowing how to act in first class, was now suddenly very invested in his in-flight magazine, pretending not to stare. Another passenger, a woman who had shifted uncomfortably during the interaction but said nothing, now glanced at Amani with an expression that seemed to teeter between shame and admiration. The same people who had been passive observers to her public disrespect now watched as accountability took form in real time. But Amani wasn't vindictive. That wasn't what this was about. It wasn't about embarrassment or revenge. It was about justice and visibility. About making sure that the pain she had been forced to swallow wasn't forgotten the moment the plane touched down. That her niece, somewhere miles away in her grief, wouldn't grow up believing that you have to yell to be heard, or that being black and dignified is somehow incompatible with being treated like you matter. Amani had long since learned that power doesn't always come with volume. Sometimes it comes with stillness, with strategy, with presence. And right now, her presence was the storm. As Tina and Blake were escorted off the plane, escorted past the very seats where they had smirked and mocked her, escorted out of the cabin where they'd made a show of exclusion, Amani sat motionless, her hands folded on her lap, her gaze fixed on the clouds beyond the window. The plane began to taxi once more, a soft lurch forward signaling the return to schedule. But nothing would go back to the way it was before. Not for Tina and Blake, not for the crew who had watched, not for the passengers who now shifted in their seats, reckoning silently with what they'd witnessed and failed to interrupt. And maybe, just maybe, not for the airline itself. This wasn't just a punishment. It was a reckoning, a line in the sand. And if you think this story ends with two people getting removed from a flight, you're mistaken. Because what Amani Wells ignited that day wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Are you still with us? Because the ripples are only just starting to move. And what comes next changes everything. Celeste Morgan didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to stand up or pound the armrest or throw her glass across the cabin. She simply was. And that was enough. Enough to shift the air. Enough to make everyone in first class suddenly, unmistakably aware. She had endured the kind of quiet, belittling moment that might have shattered someone else. A champagne request denied not because it wasn't available, but because someone didn't believe she belonged. A flight attendant's voice laced with condescension, the veiled accusation that she must have wandered into the wrong seat. The laughter shared between two crew members, just barely hushed but loud enough to cut. And through it all, Celeste didn't blink. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, every inch of her posture regal. She looked not like someone who had been humiliated, but like someone who had seen this before many times and had simply grown too strong to let it shake her. The shift didn't happen all at once. It began as something small, a hush in the cabin, a pause in conversation. The businessman beside her, who had once smirked at the awkwardness of the moment, now fidgeted nervously with on his watch. A couple 2 rows ahead suddenly couldn't seem to settle into their seats. The air was thick, not with anger, but with realization. Something isn't right here, their silence seemed to say. And Celeste, without uttering a word, had made them feel it. That's the power of dignity. Not the kind that's polite or performative, but the kind that walks in with you, stays with you through the storm, and holds its ground when everything around you is trying to shrink your existence. Celeste's presence was a mirror, and now the entire cabin had to look into it. She didn't need sympathy. She didn't need anyone to fight her battle for her, but she needed and deserved to be seen. That's what presence like hers demands. Not pity, but respect. And slowly the people around her started to feel the difference. It was in the way the other flight attendants approached her now. Not with the cold detachment from earlier, but with eyes lowered, voices softer, hands trembling slightly as they offered water, snacks, anything. The same people who had dismissed her minutes ago were now unsure, guilt creeping into the corners of their carefully curated customer service routines. And still, Celeste remained motionless, because she understood something that so many people never learn. When you have been wronged, your power isn't in proving your worth. It's in refusing to let them question it in the first place. She didn't argue that she belonged. She knew she did. She didn't list her credentials, though she could have: degrees, accolades, the board seats she held, the foundation she'd built from scratch. She didn't pull rank. She didn't have to. Her stillness was her rank. Her composure was her resistance. And the longer she sat in that seat, unmoved and unbothered, the more everyone else started to shift. The young woman working coach kept glancing forward nervously, clearly aware that something had gone very wrong up front. Even passengers who had once ignored her now couldn't look away. One woman slowly lowered her magazine, her brow furrowed in thought. A man across the aisle opened his mouth, then closed it again, perhaps weighing whether to apologize or stay silent and safe. Celeste noticed it all. She always did. That was the thing about being composed. It didn't mean you weren't feeling. It meant you were choosing how and when to respond. And that choice, in this moment, was more powerful than any outburst could have been. Because Celeste wasn't just commanding attention. She was shifting awareness. Not just of what had happened to her, but of the quiet complicity that had allowed it to happen. She was holding up a mirror, not just to the crew, but to every single person who had looked away when she was questioned, when she was mocked, when her worth was doubted because of the color of her skin and the certainty in her posture. She wasn't punishing them, she was forcing them to see. And that is what we need to talk about. We are so quick to applaud people when they shout, when they scream, when they march down aisles demanding justice. And that fight matters. It always will. But what about the women like Celeste? The ones who sit in their strength and shift the room just by being in it. The ones who absorb the sting of cruelty and respond not with rage, but with razor-sharp stillness. Who teach us, quietly but unmistakably, that you do not need to explain yourself to people who never saw you clearly to begin with. That is why we need to lift her up. That's why we have to share stories like this. Because presence, real, grounded, powerful presence, is a form of protest all its own. And Celeste Morgan showed us what it looks like in real time. So if you've ever witnessed injustice and felt it freeze your breath, if you've ever been treated like you didn't belong somewhere you earned your place in, if you've ever held your head high while the world tried to lower it, let Celeste's story remind you that staying calm is not surrender. It is strategy. It is strength. And if her stillness moved you the way it moved that entire cabin, show her some love. Like this post to stand with Celeste. Comment with a, if you've ever had to fight with grace. Share this story so others can feel the ripple of her presence. Because her story is bigger than a seat, bigger than champagne. It's about the ground shifting and the quiet storm that made it happen. Are you feeling it? Then don't scroll past. Lift her up. Let her know you see her. Because in a world that often applauds the loudest voice, sometimes the greatest strength is in the one who never needed to raise hers to be heard. At first, it looked like nothing would happen. Renee Caldwell sat in her first-class seat, serene but bruised beneath the surface. She had just endured a moment so pointed, so quietly humiliating, that it seemed designed to make her shrink, but she hadn't. When the flight attendant had denied her request for champagne with that clipped smile, the kind reserved for people who weren't supposed to be where they were, Renee hadn't flinched. And when the snickering started, shared glances between attendants, the smug chuckle from the man across the aisle who hadn't even tried to hide his amusement, she had stayed still, her poise anchored like a stone in deep water. She wasn't surprised, not anymore. but it still hurt. The ache wasn't just in the moment. It was in the buildup of 1,000 moments like it. And yet, as she sat there with the sting fresh on her skin, something incredible began to unfold, not through confrontation, but through example. Because Renee didn't just defend her dignity, she defined it. And that changed everything around her. It started with the businessman in 2B. He was sharp-suited and sharper-tongued, the type who exhaled entitlement and wore smugness like a tailored accessory. When Renee had first boarded, he'd barely acknowledged her. But when she was questioned about her seat, asked if she was sure she was in first class, he'd smiled, actually smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't warm or kind but complicit. That "I've seen this before and it doesn't surprise me" kind of smirk that lingers long after the moment ends. But now that Renee had made a quiet call, now that the senior operations manager had walked onto the plane and addressed her by name with a respectful nod, everything changed. That same businessman watched it all unfold. He watched the manager apologize publicly, watched the offending attendants get pulled aside, watched the dynamic shift. And slowly, something in his expression cracked. The confidence drained, the mask slipped. He began to squirm in his seat, adjusting his cufflinks over and over, clearing his throat, unable to escape what he just witnessed, or more truthfully, what he just enabled. And he wasn't the only one. In the galley, the youngest flight attendant, Elena, stood frozen. She hadn't said anything earlier, hadn't laughed, but she also hadn't stepped in. When the champagne was withheld, when Renee was mocked just a few feet away, Elena had looked down at her shoes and told herself it wasn't her place. She'd felt the wrongness in her bones, but let fear of retaliation, of disruption, convince her to stay quiet. But now, watching Renee sit tall, elegant, and perfectly composed, even as the atmosphere shifted like tectonic plates, Elena felt something else rise inside her. Shame. And more importantly, resolve. She knew she couldn't go back and fix her silence, but maybe she could still do something. She stepped out slowly, tray in hand, her knuckles pale around its edges. "Miss Caldwell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can I offer you something? We have fresh salmon," and Renee turned to her, and for a moment, Elena faltered. She expected rage or coldness or maybe nothing at all. But instead, Renee offered a small, polite nod. "Thank you. The salmon would be lovely." That moment, so simple, felt seismic. Elena blinked. She's still gracious, she thought, even after everything. And that changed something in her. A seed of courage planted, ready to grow. Meanwhile, back in 2B, the businessman could no longer contain his discomfort. He leaned slightly toward Renee, cleared his throat, and said, "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, I didn't mean to." His words stumbled out like a child caught lying. Renee looked at him, expression cool but not cruel. "Didn't mean to what?" she asked gently. He swallowed. "I guess I didn't realize how wrong that was. I should have said something." Renee held his gaze. It's not about saying something after the damage is done. It's about not letting it happen in the first place. And then she returned her gaze to the window, not with disdain, but with the calm of a woman who'd made her point without raising her voice. And everyone felt it. Even the woman across the aisle who had once looked away during the commotion now leaned forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice thick with sincerity. "I just wanted to say, how you handled that, it was incredible, graceful. I don't know that I could have done it." Renee didn't offer a speech, just a faint, warm smile. "You could. You just have to decide not to let the moment define you. You define it." The ripple grew. By the time the flight landed, it wasn't just the attendants who had been dismissed. It was the entire dynamic that had been dismissed. The quiet injustice, the assumed hierarchy, the unspoken belief that dignity had to be earned rather than honored. And all of it had shifted because of how Renee carried herself, not in reaction, but in intention. She became more than a passenger. She became a turning point. And for those who witnessed her, who had once been passive, their silence had become awareness. And maybe, just maybe, the next time something like that happened, someone would speak up. Not after, but during. And now, to you, the one listening, the one watching this unfold, You may not have been in that cabin, but the ripple doesn't end there. It continues here, in your screen, in your space, in you. Renee Caldwell didn't ask for attention. She didn't demand applause. But if her strength moved you, say something. Because when we uplift those who stand with dignity, we remind the world that grace is powerful, that presence is transformative, and that silence, when broken with intention, can echo farther than any scream. Leave them in the comments if you admire Renee's quiet power. Share a time you saw someone make a difference by staying composed. Tag someone who needs this reminder. You don't have to be loud to be powerful, because the ripple starts with one person. And today, it started with Renee. Let's make sure it doesn't stop here. Maya Lennox sat perfectly still, the cabin lights glinting off the curve of her cheekbone, her hands resting in her lap with an elegance that didn't ask for approval. It assumed it. The hum of the aircraft felt distant now, like background noise to something much heavier that had settled in the air. Moments ago, the flight attendants who had humiliated her had been escorted off the plane. Removed, dismissed, passengers were whispering, eyes darting her way with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. But Maya wasn't satisfied. Not yet. She had been through too much, seen too much, lived through too many polished apologies and hollow gestures to think that accountability ended with two people losing their uniforms. What had happened to her? A first-class passenger questioned, belittled, and denied the basic decency extended to those around her. It wasn't about two bad actors. It was about a system, a culture, a silent network of unchecked behavior that had for too long made women like her feel like guests in spaces they had every right to occupy. And Maya had no intention of letting that system off the hook. So when the senior operations manager returned to her row, clipboard in hand, apology ready on his lips, she didn't give him the relief of a smile. She turned to him calmly, her eyes steady. "I'm aware the two attendants have been removed," she said evenly. "But I need to know, what are you doing about the rest of it?" He blinked, taken aback. "I'm sorry?" Maya leaned forward slightly, her tone not raised but undeniably firm. "What are you doing about the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place?" The murmurs in the cabin quieted again. Passengers leaned in. This wasn't over, they realized. This wasn't about revenge. This was about truth. Maya had spent years in spaces like these, gleaming boardrooms, elite conferences, global stages, watching people talk in circles around equity while doing nothing to build it. She'd had her ideas dismissed until someone else repeated them louder. Had her presence doubted? Her expertise questioned. Her leadership softened to fit someone else's comfort. And still, she'd risen. Gracefully, sharply, but not without cost. That's what they didn't see. The toll it took to stay composed when everything in you wanted to scream. To educate with dignity when exhaustion sat heavy in your bones. To walk into spaces not built for you and still leave a legacy behind. And this flight, this moment, it was just one more space. One more chance to decide if she would let it pass or if she would draw a line. The manager, to his credit, tried. "We're reviewing our crew training and that's not enough," Maya cut in gently. "Training only works if the people leading it believe in what they're teaching. And that doesn't happen unless leadership is accountable, unless the culture shifts. I want more than training modules. I want change I can measure." Her voice didn't waver, but there was emotion underneath, controlled but electric. The kind of emotion that came not from a single insult, but from the accumulation of 100 quiet indignities. From the looks, the questions, the laughter that wasn't meant to be heard but always was. From watching others be treated with warmth while she was treated with suspicion. That pain, that invisible weight, was threaded into every word she now spoke, not as a victim, but as a force of reckoning. She told the manager in the cabin what too many people only whispered to each other, that the issue wasn't isolated, that the disrespect she'd faced was embedded in policies, in neutral protocols that were anything but. That bias didn't always come with slurs. It came with smirks, with extra verifications, with the kind of professionalism that turned icy the moment she stepped on board. "You want to show me this matters?" she said. "Start by reviewing hiring practices, promotion pathways, disciplinary trends, who gets protected and who gets punished. Don't just fix what happened to me. Prevent it from happening again." The businessman across the aisle, who'd once looked at her with mild amusement, now stared like a student in a lecture. The woman 2 rows back, who had said nothing when Maya was embarrassed earlier, now gave a slow, solemn nod. And in the galley, the remaining crew stood very, very still because they were hearing something they couldn't unhear. The truth was louder than any engine. The manager's face changed then, not just from embarrassment, but from understanding. "You're right," he said quietly but clearly. "We've failed to look deeper. That stops now. I'll be reporting this directly to the executive board." He hesitated, then added, "Would you consider consulting with us during the review process?" It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a door. And Maya had spent her life walking through doors like this, not just for herself, but for those who would come after her. She nodded slowly. "I will, but not for appearances. If I step in, it's going to be real, transparent, uncomfortable even. Can your leadership handle that?" He met her gaze. "I believe they can, and if they can't, we'll replace them." Only then did Maya relax slightly in her seat, her shoulders loosening as if a decades-long weight had shifted. Not disappeared, but shifted, because change didn't come from punishing individuals. It came from rebuilding the ground they stood on. And now, to you, yes, you, listening on the other side of this story, if you felt something stir as Maya spoke truth to power, if you've ever watched someone challenge a broken system, not with rage, but with strategy, then take a moment now, honor her to her. Comment below with if Maya's courage lit something in you. Drop a whooping if you believe in holding systems, not just people, accountable. And tag someone who needs to hear this, that dignity and disruption can coexist. Because Maya didn't just demand justice for herself, she held a mirror up to the entire system and asked it to look harder. As the flight hummed steadily through the clouds, Amara Linton sat quietly in seat 1A, her gaze fixed on the sky beyond the window, but her mind anchored in a deeper place, somewhere far older than the cabin, older than the insult she'd endured just an hour earlier. The flight attendant had questioned her first-class seat with a thinly veiled smirk, then dismissed her request for champagne as if it were a luxury beyond her station. Others had watched, some with amusement, others with silence heavy on their lips. But Amara had not flinched. She had not raised her voice. She had not even blinked. Instead, she'd responded with the kind of poised, quiet strength that had been etched into her bones long before she'd ever earned her place on this plane. That strength didn't come from policy or privilege. It came from legacy. From her grandmother's voice whispering through memory, "Don't let them rattle you, baby." Quiet strength can shake the earth if you know how to hold it. And she had. Amara had held that strength when the stairs tried to shrink her, when the laughter from the galley burned like coals on her back, when the air turned thick with microaggressions disguised as customer service. She had smiled, not with sweetness, but with steel. And when the senior operations manager boarded the plane and asked to speak with her directly, she didn't act surprised. She simply nodded. Calm, clear, calculated. She knew what she carried, not just the weight of the moment, but the weight of generations who had faced far worse and still endured. As he apologized, voice formal, badge gleaming, hands fidgeting with a clipboard, Amara listened with an expression carved from dignity itself. He spoke of corrective actions, of crew dismissals, of training programs. And when he paused, waiting for her response, she said only, "That's a start." Because it was, but it wasn't enough. Her voice didn't tremble as she explained that this moment wasn't new to her, that these small acts of exclusion weren't isolated. They were inherited, passed down, just like resistance. "My grandmother," she said softly, "used to clean houses for women who would never share a table with her, but she always walked in with her head high. She never let their silence define her worth. That's where I come from." The manager stood quiet, eyes lowered. Her words didn't require a response. They required understanding. What they didn't know was that just before boarding, Amara had read a note tucked into her travel bag, a folded piece of lined paper in her grandmother's hand. She always brought one when she traveled, little fragments of handwritten strength. This one read, "Walk in every room like your ancestors built it." She had stared at those words while waiting at the gate, drawing from them the same way her grandmother once drew from scripture and hymns and the quiet conviction that she was more than how the world treated her. That note wasn't just sentimental, it was armor. So when the disrespect came, Amara was ready. Not because she expected it, though she always did, but because she had learned not to let it pull her out of herself. That was her grandmother's greatest lesson. They'll try to make you small so they don't have to see how big you are. Don't shrink for nobody, sugar. Don't ever shrink. She had passed that down not just with words, but with the way she lived, fighting for respect in a world that handed it out by skin tone and surname. Amara had watched her grandmother hold her head high even when neighbors crossed the street to avoid her, even when customers whispered behind her back, even when the banks denied her loans but borrowed her recipes for the local paper. She had watched her turn dignity into a weapon, grace into a shield. And now, as the passengers on Flight 243 tried to make sense of what they had seen, why the manager had come, why the attendants were removed, why Amara sat unmoved while everyone else flinched, Amara knew her grandmother would be proud. This wasn't just a moment. This was a ripple in a legacy. Because Amara hadn't acted alone. She had brought generations with her. Every quiet act of rebellion, every refusal to bow her head, every time her grandmother whispered, "You belong everywhere your feet touch," it had all led to this, not a confrontation, but a clarification. That dignity isn't something granted by systems. It's something you bring with you. And when you carry it with enough steadiness, systems have to adjust. Later in the flight, the cabin was hushed. The man who had chuckled earlier now stared out the window, his reflection broken by turbulence. A woman down the road dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, unashamed. Even the remaining crew walked slower, spoke softer, as if the very air around Amara had grown heavier, charged with the kind of presence that could not be ignored. And now, to you, the one listening, reading, feeling this in your chest, if you've ever had someone in your life, a mother, a grandmother, a quiet elder, who gave you strength with nothing but a glance or a whispered prayer, then you already know who Amara is. You know her because you are her, because her story is not rare. It's just rarely told. And if it stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Leave a comment with, "If someone in your family gave you strength that still carries you today." Drop a down if you believe legacy is power and quiet resistance is revolutionary. Share this if you believe the strength of our ancestors still walks with us. Because Amara didn't stand up to shout. She sat still, and the whole world moved around her. Her grandmother once told her, "The seeds you plant in silence will bloom when the world least expects it." Today, those seeds bloomed at 30,000 feet. Let's not forget it. When Dr. Ava Richardson boarded Flight 811, she carried with her more than just her monogrammed leather briefcase and a soft cashmere scarf that had belonged to her late mother. She carried exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't just come from travel, but from constantly walking into spaces that question your presence before you've even sat down. She had just finished a week of keynote speeches and late-night strategy meetings at a global education summit. Her message had been clear. True change doesn't come from rebranding, it comes from responsibility. But she hadn't expected to be called to embody that lesson so immediately, so painfully on her return flight home. When she reached her first-class seat, 1C, Ava was looking forward to a moment of silence, maybe a glass of champagne, and the steady hum of altitude to soothe her overworked spirit. But instead, she was met with cold skepticism. The lead flight attendant, Nicole, according to her badge, blocked her from entering the aisle. "Ma'am, this is priority boarding only," she said with a tone too sharp to be professional. "I know," Ava replied, her voice calm, presenting her boarding pass. "This is my seat." Nicole scanned it, lips pursed, and muttered a reluctant "fine" before stepping aside. But it didn't end there. When Ava asked for champagne once seated, something every other first-class passenger was offered without hesitation, Nicole narrowed her eyes and said, "We reserve that for our premium guests." A hush fell around her as nearby passengers overheard. One man chuckled behind his magazine. A younger woman looked up and quickly looked away. Ava simply blinked. "I am a premium guest," she said firmly but with control. "You're welcome to verify again." Nicole snatched the boarding pass back, double-checked it, then returned it without comment. No apology, no champagne, just silence. Ava sat still, her fingers tightening around the armrest, heart pounding. Not from anger, but from the familiar ache of being diminished, of being disrespected in a place she'd earned access to 10 times over. But she didn't raise her voice. Instead, she pulled out her phone, took a steadying breath, and sent a message. Not to a friend, not to an attorney, but to someone who could move mountains. The recipient? Samuel Jennings, CEO of Global Air. A colleague, a former classmate, someone who had once told her, if you ever experience anything questionable on one of our flights, come to me directly. She did. Within 15 minutes, the energy on the plane changed. The captain came on the intercom announcing a brief delay for operational coordination. Nicole disappeared into the galley. A junior attendant with anxious eyes was sent to Ava's seat with a tray of fruit and juice. Ma'am, would you like something else while we wait? Ava declined with a gentle shake of her head, never breaking her poise. What she didn't say, but everyone around her could feel, was that the weight was no longer hers. It belonged to the system now. She had passed the moment to those who had built it. What the other passengers didn't know, what Nicole certainly didn't know, was that Ava had spent years advising global organizations on how to dismantle systemic inequity. She had written textbooks on institutional bias. She had trained ambassadors, CEOs, and university presidents. And now she was being asked if she belonged. On a seat she paid for, it wasn't just insulting, it was symbolic. When the cabin door reopened, every head turned. In stepped a man in a Navy suit with a Global Air security badge and a tablet in hand. He didn't smile. He didn't pause. He went straight to Nicole and the other crew members, asking them to step aside for a private conversation. There were no fireworks, no raised voices, just a quiet storm gathering force in the front cabin of a luxury aircraft. When he returned moments later, he addressed Ava directly. Dr. Richardson, he began, and his use of her title was deliberate. On behalf of Global Air, I want to express our sincere apologies. The conduct you experienced was unacceptable and is being addressed immediately. She thanked him politely but didn't let him off the hook. It's not just about conduct, she replied. It's about culture. Those words hit deeper than any accusation could, and Samuel Jennings heard them loud and clear. Within 24 hours of Ava's flight landing, Global Air issued a public apology. But more importantly, they acted. Nicole and her fellow attendant were terminated, not as a performative gesture, but because a thorough internal investigation revealed a pattern of complaints. Ava received a personal call from Samuel, not just to apologize, but to invite her into a more meaningful role. We need your expertise, he said, not as a guest, as a guide. And that's how Ava Richardson became the lead chair of Global Air's newly formed Equity and Inclusion Council. The council didn't just meet in polished rooms. It visited airports. It conducted unannounced audits. Ava helped create a direct reporting app for passengers, designed policy interventions for hiring and promotion, and led mandatory immersive training for all levels of airline staff, not just customer-facing, but corporate leadership too. She insisted on transparency, on measuring what mattered. You don't get to claim progress, was she said at the launch, unless you're willing to track what was broken and who's been harmed along the way. But what truly moved people wasn't just Ava's reform work, it was her story. She later shared it publicly in an essay titled Seat 1C, Where I Belonged. In it, she recounted that moment on the plane, the condescension, the erasure, the choice not to shout but to build. She ended it with these words: we don't always get to choose our battles, but we do get to choose what we build from them. And now, if you're still listening, this is where you come in. Because Ava didn't go viral for outrage. She wasn't trending for tantrums. She became a symbol for what dignity can do when it's coupled with power, strategy, and heart. She took a moment of quiet humiliation and turned it into an engine for lasting change. But she didn't do it alone. So if her story resonated with you, drop a boy in the comments if you believe calm strength can still move mountains. Leave a 5 if you want to see more women like Ava leading real reform. And share this story with someone who needs to be reminded. You don't have to yell to be powerful. You just have to refuse to disappear. Because Dr. Ava Richardson didn't just reclaim her seat. She rebuilt the system around it. Danielle Reese didn't celebrate when the flight attendants were removed from the aircraft. She didn't smile when the airline executives flooded her inbox with apology emails, or when the CEO personally called to thank her for her grace under pressure. Because for Danielle, the injustice she experienced wasn't about two people in one flight. It was about the pattern, the machine that allowed moments like that to unfold in silence, again and again, for people who didn't have the titles or connections or unshakable poise that she carried like armor. That flight, where she had been dismissed, mocked, and questioned for daring to exist in first class, wasn't her first time facing quiet discrimination. But it would be the last time the airline saw it as a PR incident instead of a call for reconstruction. Danielle wasn't interested in polite apologies. She was there for the long game. So when the CEO asked her, with careful sincerity, if she would consider joining the airline's new Equity Advisory Council, she didn't say yes right away. She said, only if you're serious about listening when it gets uncomfortable. And when he replied, we are, she said, then I'm in. But I'm not here to decorate the diversity brochure. I'm here to build something that doesn't vanish when the news cycle moves on. Danielle showed up to that first council meeting and not in performative outrage, but with binders of research, lived experience, and a clarity that cut through corporate fluff like glass through silk. She remembered how it felt to be treated like an intruder in a seat she paid for, to have attendants laugh about her under their breath, to feel the stares of passengers who'd been too quiet for too long. She used that memory to power every decision she made. And as she sat at the long mahogany boardroom table overlooking the airline's headquarters, she wasn't thinking about titles or optics. She was thinking about results and how many more passengers she could protect from ever having to experience what she had. Her first move? Tracking. Not promises, not platitudes, metrics. She demanded that the airline begin collecting internal data on bias-related complaints across all flight routes. She helped design a new reporting platform that allowed passengers and employees to anonymously flag discriminatory incidents and then ensured those reports were reviewed by an independent ethics team, not the same HR staff who'd brushed off concerns for years. If you can't measure the rot, she told the room, you'll never know how deep it goes. But even as she rebuilt policy, Danielle didn't forget emotion. That was her secret power, the ability to be both rigorous and real. In one council meeting, she read aloud excerpts from letters sent in by passengers who had experienced similar microaggressions on their flights. Black women questioned, parents of color scrutinized, non-English speakers mocked. Her voice didn't tremble, but her eyes burned. This isn't theory, she said. This is what your culture feels like on the ground. It's not just broken, it's painful. One executive shifted uncomfortably, another cleared his throat. No one looked her in the eye for a full minute, and still Danielle stayed, because staying is the hardest part. Anyone can spark change when the cameras are watching, but lasting change? That's made in the moments when no one is clapping, when the enthusiasm dies down, when the initial fire fades and all that's left is the long, gritty work of transforming a system from the inside out. Danielle stayed through it all, through resistance, through backtracking, through well-meaning coworkers who said things like, but do you think it was really racist? Or we don't want to make the crew feel targeted. She responded not with anger, but with unwavering clarity. If accountability feels like an attack, you were never ready for responsibility in the first place. And people listened. Months passed, the airline's culture began to shift. Not fast, not perfectly, but meaningfully. Crew members who had once joked in the aisles now attended training with open notebooks. New hires began their onboarding with mandatory equity seminars. Leadership started reviewing performance through a new lens, not just how well someone served, but how well they respected. Danielle kept watching, kept questioning, kept reminding them that this was not a campaign, it was a commitment, and she knew the difference because she lived it. Late one evening, she received an email from a young flight attendant named Laura. Ms. Reese, it read, I wanted to say thank you. I was on a flight last week where a passenger was being treated poorly, and because of your new reporting system, I knew exactly what to do. I filed a report, I followed up, and for the first time in my career, I felt like I was allowed to speak up and that someone would actually listen. Danielle sat at her desk, the glow of the screen illuminating her quiet smile. Not triumphant, Not proud, just steady. The kind of smile that says, this is what it's for. And now, if you're still listening, if you've made it to this part of Danielle's story, this is where you come in. Because we live in a world full of moments, viral videos, corporate statements, headlines that flicker and fade. But Danielle Reese is doing the work that lives after the hashtags disappear. The work that holds people accountable, not once, but always. She didn't stop after they fired 2 people. She stayed to build a system that made it impossible for their replacements to do the same harm. She stayed so someone else wouldn't have to feel small just to stay safe. And that deserves more than applause. It deserves your support. Leave a in the comments if Danielle's resilience lit something in you. Drop a if you believe in building justice that stays after the storm. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that showing up again and again is where real power lives. Because Danielle didn't just demand change. She became it. And she stayed long enough to make sure it didn't disappear. The ripples started in silence. Alyssa Monroe hadn't set out to spark change when she boarded Flight 790. She hadn't planned to teach anyone a lesson or become a symbol of quiet strength. She simply wanted to sit in the seat she paid for, sip her champagne, and enjoy a few hours of peace after a long season of tireless work. But when her simple request was denied with disdain, when the flight attendants whispered and smirked, when the cabin filled with judgment and assumption instead of welcome and respect, Alyssa chose not to be small. She didn't shout. She didn't break. She picked up her phone and, with the calm precision of someone who had learned over time to stand in her worth, she made a single call. That call, carried on steady breath and quiet conviction, set off a chain reaction that none of them saw coming. And now, months later, Alyssa stood on the tarmac of the airline's headquarters, a warm breeze rustling her scarf as she prepared to deliver the keynote at Global Air's first ever Equity in the Skies Summit. Beside her, young flight attendants smiled nervously, some of them barely old enough to remember a time when passengers like her were dismissed without consequence. And inside, across dozens of cities, across thousands of employees, the ripples she had created had become currents of reform. New training programs, revised service protocols, passenger equity audits, anonymous feedback systems, and the naming of Alyssa herself as the airline's first passenger experience integrity advisor. What began as humiliation had bloomed into transformation. And yet, the most profound change hadn't happened in the boardrooms or media briefings. It had happened in the people. The woman 2 rows behind Alyssa, who had once stayed silent, now mentored young women on how to speak up with compassion and courage. The junior attendant who had trembled when offering her juice later became a program coordinator for Global Air's diversity training team. Even the businessman who had once scoffed at her now sat on the same advisory board, his tone quieter, his eyes more open. It hadn't been overnight. Growth never is. But that's the thing about ripples. You don't always see how far they reach. Alyssa's quiet strength had become a reference point for so many, a model of what it means to respond, not react, to stand without shouting, to lead without demanding. Her story traveled further than she ever intended, and yet exactly where it needed to go. After her speech that morning, a young woman named Brielle approached her in tears. "Ms. Monroe," she said, her voice shaking, "you don't know me, but I watched that video of your flight. I was going to quit this job. I didn't think there was a place for people like me in this space, but you made me stay. You made me believe." Alyssa smiled, tears gently brimming in her own eyes. She reached out and held Brielle's hands. "Then keep going," she said. "And when it's your turn to speak, speak. When it's your turn to lead, lead. And if you're ever treated like you don't belong, remember you do. Always." In that moment, Alyssa felt the full circle of her grandmother's words. The ripples you create today will shape the currents of tomorrow. And they had. Because of that one moment on a plane, policies had changed. But more than that, hearts had shifted. And now for you, the listener, the reader, the one who stayed until the end of this story, this is more than just a happy ending. This is a beginning for your life too. Because here's what Alyssa's journey teaches us. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to fight loud to be powerful. Strength can look like stillness. And sometimes the most lasting change doesn't come from fire, but from grace held with precision. There will be times in your life when you're treated as less than, when someone makes you feel small, When the world looks at you and doesn't see your value. In those moments, you have a choice. Will you shrink to make others comfortable? Or will you stand, even quietly, in your truth? Let Alyssa's story remind you, your calm can be revolutionary. Your presence can bend systems. Your dignity can leave trails others follow. So if her story moved you, if you felt seen, heard, or empowered, leave them in the comments to let Alyssa know she's not alone. Comment with, if you believe in creating ripples of change, one moment at a time, and share this story with someone who needs the reminder that they don't have to raise their voice to raise the standard. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's one way you can be a ripple in someone's life this week? And if you believe in the power of stories like this, stories of resilience, quiet strength, and real transformation, then don't miss the next one. Hit that like button to support stories that uplift and inspire. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like Alyssa's. Turn on notifications to be part of this growing wave of dignity, justice, and hope. Because this isn't just Alyssa's story, it's ours. And the current she created, it's still moving. Let's ride it together.